Arlene, can you hit *6 again?
All right, I'll just decline this.
That's all you have to do. *6.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, let me stop this, see if it helps. Noise. So, as is common practice, the first thing I do is go to Rashi. I'm going to hang up for a second and call back in and see if this is any better. I'm sorry, just getting a lot of feedback. All right, I'm going to call in from my phone. All right, give me a second. Let me see if it makes a difference. So the only other explanation I can think of is that it's coming from the tablet. So I'm going to use the computer instead of the tablet. I thought it would make things easier, but none of it's going to create this havoc. All right, so while I set that up, we'll continue. So as is common practice, the first thing we do when we read a verse is we go to Rashi. Right, so Rashi says, the commandment that you shall not put him to the test, and that you should not doubt him. So they were being tested about not testing, is what it seems like Rashi is saying. Now, just going back to what I was saying about sources where we see that the reason was as a punishment. So this is in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. Does somebody want to read that?
I'll do it, Shelley.
Thanks, Shelley.
In this very wilderness shall your carcasses drop. Of all of you who were recorded in your various lists from the age of 20 years up, You who have muttered against me, not one shall enter the land in which I swore to settle you, save Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. Your children, who you said would be carried off, these will I allow to enter, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But your carcasses shall drop in this wilderness, while their children roam the wilderness for 40 years, suffering for your faithlessness, until the last of your carcasses is down in the wilderness.
Right, so that certainly indicates to me the theme of punishment, right, as a consequence. And then we have another verse, and this one in the book of Joshua. I'll just read it. For the Israelites had traveled in the wilderness 40 years until the entire nation, the men of military age who had left Egypt, had perished because they had not obeyed the Lord, and the Lord had sworn never to let them see the land of the Lord had sworn for their fathers. Right. So over here, it doesn't get into the spy story necessarily, but again, it makes it clear that it's a consequence. And then this verse, well, I meant to take it out, never mind. Medrash. So here we go to general testing. Does somebody want to read this one?
I'll do it. It's Lenore.
Sure.
And God did prove Abraham. Observe this difference between the earlier generations and the later generations. The earlier generations were tested by the Holy One, blessed be He, as it is said, and God did prove Abraham. And Scripture elsewhere states regarding the generation of the desert that He might afflict thee to prove thee, to note what was in thy heart. But later generations were tested by the nations of the world, for it is said, now these are the nations which the Lord left to prove Israel by them.
All right, so here's an example where God is kind of using a third party to test them. And that story, I'm not sure if I brought reference to it, is that when they actually went into the land of Canaan and all of that, they didn't end up conquering all of it. There were parts of it they didn't. And the question became, what happened? Right? This was the promised land. And the answer is that they failed the test. And therefore they weren't allowed to conquer those pieces. So this is Targum Yonatan on our verse in our portion. And remember all the way by which the Lord your God has led you through these 40 years in the wilderness to humble and try you. Right? So this is another theme that we'll go into a little bit later, which is, why does God test us? What's, that's a really, I know for me, that's a hard theology to accept. And I imagine that is for a lot of you as well, this idea of suffering as a test. Over here, he seems to be saying it's to humble us. All right, so it's a tool for self-refinement. All right, I'm going to try presenting one time and see. That noise has gotten better. Let's see if I shut that other thing off, if it's going to get better. It didn't change a thing, did it? All right. I don't know what the story is. Okay.
The sound is fine.
Oh, the sound is fine now? Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. Good. Let me bring it back to there. We read this already. Joshua, here we go. No, we didn't get that far. Right there. This is, I think, where we got. Yeah, here. So just to bring some examples of testing in the Torah, and then we'll open it up to discussion. This is the famous one that we read on the high holidays. Sometime afterwards, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. Right? So, this is an extremely troubling example where God is testing him by telling him he needs to sacrifice his son. The other example, which I didn't go into, is the book of Job, where it says that Job's children died as part of this test to test Job, which seems kind of cruel on a simple level, or a complicated level too. All right, and more broadly, in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, it says, with 10 tests, Abraham, our father, was tested, and he withstood them all. So that test wasn't enough, the Akedah, but he had 9 other ones in order to show how great his love was. Peace be upon him. So the Bartanura is one of the commentators that tries to figure out what tests are we talking about. In the Mishnah, it's a list of a bunch of different things, and it's kind of like a number. Where do we see the number 3? We have several examples of 3 or 10 or 40. So it's one of the things about 10 is it says that Abraham was tested 10 times. So the Bartanura spells it out. I'm not going to get too far into all of these references. Or caused him when Nimrod cast him into the fiery furnace for rejecting the idols. When God told him to leave his home and to have faith. When there was a famine, when he went down to Egypt and said that his wife was his sister. In a war. Doing circumcision. All right. And then the other really difficult one was when his wife wanted him to kick out his other son. And he was really disturbed, obviously, and God told him to follow what she said. So following that Mishnah, we have another Mishnah, which says 10 miracles were wrought for our ancestors in Egypt, 10 at the sea, 10 plagues, and then 10 trials. With 10 trials did our ancestors try God, blessed be he. As it is said, and why have tried me with 10 times? Right, so in this case, it's our ancestors testing God. The Bartanura comes again and gives examples of that. 2 at the sea, where it states, and there are no graves in Egypt. When they came to the split sea before it split, they were like, we'd rather be slaves than die here. And then with the, when they were complaining that there wasn't enough food, and they were like, hey, we're not vegetarians over here. This manna is nice, but it's not enough. And different examples like that. All right. So why does God test us? And if anybody has a question or a comment, just jump in. So the Ramban, not to be confused with the Rambam, Nachmanides says, in referring to Abraham, and behold, every test in the Torah is for the good of the one being tested. All right, so this is the theology that, in simple words, means that what looks bad to you is actually good for you. Right? and and the idea is that there's a bigger picture that we can't see, and sometimes we actually experience that. Sometimes somebody gets a little minor injury, they go into the hospital, they get a CAT scan, and they notice a cancer or some other life-threatening thing that they wouldn't have known about before it was too late. And it's like, you know what, that injury, which seemed like a bad thing, when I look at it in the broader picture, is a really good thing, right? It's not always that easy to find, and a lot of people have a hard time with this, as you can imagine. So from the Ramban, it isn't clear if the test itself is good for the one being tested, or the reward for passing the test. Right? Is there value in the test itself as refinement, and to help us be humble? Or is it the test itself is just a means to an end, and the end being that if we pass the test, we get rewarded? Seforno also on Bereshit. Does somebody want to read?
It's Judy. I could read it.
Thanks, Judy.
Okay. He intended that Abraham's love and awe of God be in actuality, not merely potential, and in doing so, he would more closely resemble God, whose goodness is actualized, not merely potential. After all, the purpose of man's existence is to emulate the virtues of God as much as possible, as evidenced when God created man. He said, "Let us make man in our image," etc.
Thank you. Right, and this is similar to what I talked about on Shabbat with the commandment to keep Shabbat, where in one place in Exodus it talks, if I recall correctly, it says you should keep the Shabbat because God worked for 6 days and on the seventh day he rested. And basically the idea is the same as this: be like God and rest on the seventh day. All right, so I found a really interesting article which I would like to share. Yeah, but the link, which I thought I put in here, is not here. Let me just do this again and make sure I thought I put it in here. All right, well, I know where it is anyway. 3. Here we go. Let's see if it's going to share this tab instead. Yes. So just to review for anybody who's not familiar with this this term theodicy. Oh, actually, you know what? I think she's going to go into it in the thing itself. But just to, it basically means the study of divine justice. Anybody want to read? Unfortunately, I can't see who's on. Oh, I could actually. Robert, are you able to?
No.
Okay. All right, I'll go.
Can you hear me?
I do hear you, yeah.
Because my microphone is shown as being off. That's why I thought you couldn't hear me and I couldn't read. But since you can hear me,
it does show it as off.
Yeah, but since you hear me, I'll read anyway then.
Go for it, thank you.
The great theological challenge of the problem of suffering in ethical monotheism has been described as a trilemma, namely reconciling the reality of human suffering with the beliefs that 1. God is all good, omnibenevolent. 2. God is all-powerful, omnipotent. 3. God is all-knowing, omniscient. The term theodicy, from Greek theos, God, and dike, justice, was coined to describe the philosophical enterprise of justifying or defending God, and more broadly, for attempts to grapple with the theological and existential problem of human suffering. The Bible contains many texts that grapple directly or indirectly with theodicy. Would you like me to go on?
Yeah, keep going until you want to break. Or somebody jumps in.
Retributive theodicy. The second word of Parashat Ekev, after which it is named, denotes consequence. The parasha opens with a strong claim for retributive justice, the idea that God rewards good behavior and punishes wrongdoing. Indeed, this conception underpins the structure of the parasha as a whole. And as a consequence of your obeying these rules and observing them carefully, Adonai your God will maintain faithfully for you the covenant that he made on oath with your fathers. If you do forget Adonai your God and follow other gods to serve them or bow down to them, I warn you this day that you shall certainly perish. Like the nations that Adonai will cause to perish before you, so shall you perish as a consequence of your not heeding Adonai your God. The retributive theory of theodicy is also the basic explanation offered both in the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Leviticus for Israel's eventual exile from the land. Thus, one of the Hebrew Bible's main approaches to theodicy presumes some sort of consequential system of divine justice. This approach is applicable for both individuals. By the way, I don't know if you hear it, but there's a real thunderstorm going on here.
I did hear something.
Yes.
Maybe God doesn't want us to be learning this.
I don't know. And it's raining really, it's starting to let up a bit. Anyway, this approach is applicable for both individuals, especially in the Psalms and wisdom literature, and nations. It is fundamental to the covenantal framework of the Exodus and wilderness narratives in Torah and the historical narratives of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Similarly, the primary message of the prophets is that Israel's well-being as a nation is dependent upon its conduct.
Oops, hold on, I went too far.
Examination theodicy, divine testing. Elsewhere, the Bible follows a belief that may be characterized as examination theodicy, the idea that God wishes to see what the sufferer will do in order to reward the sufferer if he, she, they pass the test. The most famous examples of examination theodicy are in the stories of the binding of Isaac and the book of Job. Binding of Isaac. The beginning and end of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22 use testing language. Sometime afterwards, God put Abraham to the test. And he said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy." By the way, it's funny because I heard that Isaac was already in his 30s when this happened, and he's called a boy here. Anyway,
Yeah.
Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants as a consequence of your having obeyed my command.
Right. So in this case, it doesn't seem to be saying that the test itself is a good thing. It's passing the test is a good thing because you got the reward.
Here, the relationship between the language of consequence and the suffering is inverted. Because Abraham submitted to suffering, he will be rewarded as a consequence. This is the only explicit case of Abraham undergoing a trial in the Torah, but it serves as the basis for the well-known tradition about the 10 trials of Abraham found already in the Second Temple Book of Jubilees. Job. A similar understanding is implied in the narrative framework of the book of Job, although the term, what is this?
Nasa.
Nasa itself is not used in Job chapters 1 to 2 and 42. The cause of Job's tragic suffering is ascribed to instigation by the Satan, who hoped to demonstrate that Job would fail to maintain righteousness in the face of trying circumstances. God appears to allow the Satan to inflict terrible suffering on Job to prove to the Satan that Job would not sin even under these harrowing circumstances. In the end, God rewards Job for his fidelity and grants him wealth, more children, and long life.
And incidentally, there's actually an opinion, which is immediately rejected, but there is an opinion in the Talmud that the book of Job, the story there, never actually happened. And it's simply a lesson. It's there as a metaphor, which I think is pretty fascinating.
I also heard that Job was not Jewish. He was just a righteous, well, before there was Judaism. This happened maybe before Abraham.
Well, it's not explicit. It doesn't tell us, when exactly and where, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just something I remember hearing in some discussions.
Yeah.
God's lack of omniscience. Implicit in the stories of Job and the binding of Isaac is the belief that God is not omniscient and does not know the outcome of the test in advance.
Right, because if God knew what was going to happen, then you don't need the test.
Mm-hmm.
At least God doesn't need the test.
Right. Jacob Licht has argued the case that these episodes should be taken at face value. They presume that divine knowledge is less than complete and that God must engage in experimentation to acquire further data about human beings' character and behavior. The responses of human beings to divinely inflicted trials and ordeals provide God with such evidence, and God can then punish or reward them based on their behavior.
So let me just stop here for a second. So when I was looking at the different commentary, I brought Rashi, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that address that verse in our parsha, in our reading. And the vast majority of them go to the idea of the afterlife, that a person would be rewarded in the afterlife. And that's another theodicy that they're not talking about here because it's not explicit in the Torah. And this is about theodicy in the written Torah. But that is a strongly held belief by a lot of people, that things equal out in the afterlife. And so even though we might see the drug dealer happy sometimes before he gets caught or whatever, and the pious person struggling, so for example, it's so that in the afterlife, the pious person goes straight to the greatest goodness, etc. So just something to keep in mind, and that's another theodicy. That's another way of explaining things, suffering.
Which theodicy?
Rabbi, I just wanted to say, isn't there a general principle, Hakol b'yedei shamayim chutz mi'yireh shamayim?
Absolutely. You want to translate?
Yeah, everything is in the hands of God, except the fear of God. That is to say, somehow a person, there is a certain room for free will. Otherwise, the notion of, you be good and then I'll reward you is empty, because if God knows what's going to happen, if everything is preset, then what's good and what's evil? You're on a road that can't be changed. So there has to be some room for choice, for man's choice.
Right, and that goes into another one of those tricky dilemmas of this belief that God is beyond time. Right? If God is beyond time, then God has to know what's going to happen because God is there. Right? And then the question is, if God knows what's going to happen, do you still have free will? Right? Is it that God knows what you're going to choose already, but you still have agency? You're still able to make that choice or not? And it's tricky philosophical stuff, but I think it's important, because of course suffering is somewhat subjective, but especially going through pandemics, especially losing loved ones or people going through illness, we all experience that to some degree, and we need to make meaning out of it. We need to be able to, in order to maintain our sanity, in order to not, fall into depression, we need to be able to have some kind of explanation for how and why these things work. It doesn't mean that we have it all figured out, but at least, give me something. All right. Does anybody want to take over for Robert? Sharon, you want to give it a go? I don't know if she's still on. Yeah, all right.
Before she starts, I'm going to try to turn off the microphone, and you tell me, and I'm going to speak a little more, and if you can't hear me, then that's okay.
Okay.
All right?
We'll
Now I'm talking. Do you hear me?
We hear you.
So I can't turn off the microphone.
Okay, but we're not hearing any noise coming when you're quiet.
Very
so
good.
Fine. Thank you.
Which theodicy best explains the wilderness wandering? These two theories of theodicy are not mutually exclusive. God can both punish sinners and test believers. But how might these abstract theories be used to help explain Israel's history as recorded in the biblical text? The punishment of the generation of the wilderness provides an excellent test case. Retributive theodicy, Numbers. Numbers offers the retributive theodicy as the explanation for the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Your children roamed the wilderness for 40 years, suffering for your faithfulness until the last of your carcasses is down in the wilderness. You shall bear your punishment for 40 years, corresponding to the number of days, 40 days, that you scouted the land, a year for each day. Thus you shall know what it means to thwart me. In this model, the wandering is a direct punishment for the sin of the scouts and the Israelites' complicity in that sin by refusing to go up the land. Examination theodicy, Parshat Ekev,
which is our parsha.
Alternatively,
that we're going to read the Shabbat. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Parshat Ekev seems to offer an examination, theodicy explanation for the wilderness wandering. Remember the long way that Adonai your God has made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years, that he might test you by hardships to learn what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget Adonai your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its seraph, serpents and scorpions, a parched land with no water in it, who brought forth water from you from the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers had never known, in order to test you by hardships only to benefit you in the end. Educative theodicy, testing as purification. But is that what Deuteronomy really means? This understanding of theodicy as divine testing, examination, works well with Deuteronomy 8.2, which ends with whether you keep his commandments or not. Whereas Deuteronomy 8:16, which concludes with to benefit you in the end, suggests that the wilderness wandering and affliction had a purpose beyond just to test the people's loyalty. The key to understanding verse 16 may be found in the ambiguity of the word. I need help here.
Nasa. So actually, people who believe this is a common expression of nisayon, or nisyonis, which means testing. Okay.
Which does not only to mean test, like its synonymous biblical Hebrew word
Bachan.
It is also originated as a term denoting the refining of metals. For example, both roots appear as a parallel to the root
Zaraf,
smelting in Psalms 26:2, another word for smelting. Probe me, Adonai, and try me. Test my heart and min. Similar semantic overlap between purification and examining underlies the English test, derived from the Latin testum, an earthen vessel used in meteorological processes. An extension of the metaphor supposes that ordeals can be edifying and trials and tribulations, the latter word comes from the Latin for pressure, can contribute to growth. Thus, in Deuteronomy 8:16, the statement about God afflicting and
Nasa'im. So
of Israel
he's combining the Hebrew and the English in that
English, yeah.
Or
Of Israel for the nation's benefit may indicate a process of improvement through overcoming difficult experiences. The pairing with affliction in
Leman anotcha uleman nasotecha.
Okay. Points to a sense of no pain, no gain. This verse indicates that the purpose of the wilderness wanderings was to strengthen the nation and prepare
the children
of Israel for settlement in the promised land. It thus may be unconnected to the issue of divine omniscience.
Right. So it's not that God doesn't know what we're going to choose. It's not so much a test as it is a process of refining us to get us ready to deal with the challenges in the next phase.
But wouldn't you say that the older generation is not being tested anymore? They're just being punished. And because they're being punished and everyone else is being punished along with them, for the younger people who are going to actually be able to cross over into the promised land, maybe it was a kind of test. But for the older people, it's simply a punishment and not a test.
Robert, you read the author's mind.
Okay.
I don't know if she spells it out exactly the way you're saying, but that theme is definitely here.
Mm-hmm.
Vicarious educative theodicy. Educative theodicy is sometimes extended pedagogically. If sufferers
pedagogically, like teaching, yeah.
If sufferers are toughened by their difficult experiences, others can learn similar lessons vicariously through narratives about the suffering and about retributive justice. The wilderness wandering functions this way as a paradigm for later instances of Israelite sin and punishment, and a cautionary tale. So, for example, in Psalm 95, 8:10, do not be stubborn as at Meribah, on the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test, tried me, though they had seen my deeds. 40 years I was provoked by that generation.
Does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
Right, we have it on Friday night in the Lechuna Ranana.
Yeah. Thus, even if the wandering is understood as retributive justice, it also functions functions as a kind of education in the future.
All right. We'll keep going a little bit longer. If anybody needs to jump off, I understand. Nasa.
Nasa as retribution, examination, and education.
Right. So this is a theory of that it could be all of the above.
Jacob Licht, in testing the Hebrew scriptures and in post-biblical Judaism, suggested that biblical tests sometimes evoke the idea of divine testing as a sort of last resort to resolve greater theological difficulties. He shows that the book of Judges offers multiple explanations for why God left the nations in the land, requiring the Israelites to engage in conquest warfare.
And this is, I think this is the same quote that I brought from Judges earlier.
Judges 2, retributive plus examination. Then Adonai became incensed against Israel, and he said, "Since that nation has transgressed the covenant that I enjoined upon their fathers and has not obeyed me, I, for my part, will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died." Examination. For it was in order to test Israel by then, to see whether or not they would faithfully walk in the ways of Adonai as their fathers had done, that Adonai had left these nations instead of driving them out at once and had not delivered them into the hands of Joshua. Judges 3, educative plus examination. These are the nations that Adonai left so that he might test by them all the Israelites who had not known any of the wars of Canaan, so that succeeding generations of Israelites might be made to experience war.
Right, and that's what Robert was talking about.
Examination. These served as a means of testing Israel to learn whether they would obey the commandments which Adonai had enjoined them upon their fathers through Moses. The two passages in Judges each initially explain the nations that remained as a form of retribution or education, but supplement this explanation with a second, namely examination, testing theodicy. Licht suggests that the multiplicity of explanations hints at their inadequacy. Moreover, he argues the testing motive is introduced, even though it is theologically unsatisfying, because it is a way of deflecting the greater theological question of why God subjected Israel to the hardships of the conquest.
All right, so just to summarize it, and she goes into it a little bit more about the idea of mercy, that God is seeing it as the what looks like bad is good, but on some level we're taught that not to think about these things too much because you can go down a rabbit hole, and it's often unsatisfying, a lot of these explanations, because when we're suffering and when we're overwhelmed with emotions, it's not a logical experience necessarily. Sometimes we just need to vent. Sometimes we just need to feel angry or sad or whatever we're feeling when we're suffering. But to know that these things are addressed in the Torah, and that there are multiple different ways of seeing it, can be comforting. Mm-hmm. Questions, comments?
Yes, Rabbi Shelley, I just wanted to make the comment that every system of human thought somebody proved begins with certain untestable assumptions. So this system that we're examining has the assumption that there is an all-powerful God who told us in the very beginning that if you do what I tell you, good things will happen, and if you don't do what I tell you, bad things will happen. And now we are faced with the idea that really doesn't happen, that it appears to us that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. So you have to develop some kind of a reason, and these are various reasons why that initial assumption doesn't bear out. I mean, whether it's for your own good, you're being tested, or things straighten out in heaven. These are all ways to, so to speak, get around what the violation of the initial assumption is.
Yeah. And, and I think I mentioned this, I don't remember when, but, every time we read the Shema, we read the first paragraph, and then in the second paragraph, that's pretty much the point of it.
Yeah.
When you follow my ways, your vineyard will do great, and, your crops will grow. And, I'm up here in New Paltz with friends of Dora, and they planted all kinds of things. And so we just picked a bunch of blackberries, and it's nice to actually, experience some of these things in real life instead of being abstract, where you just go to Whole Foods or wherever and you pick up a bunch of strawberries. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you for joining, and I'll try to keep them interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
My pleasure. We have services tomorrow night at 7:30, and then, Friday night. All right. Take care.
By the way, Rabbi,
Yeah.
I would like to just say something when the others have already gone. So if you hold on a little bit.
You got it.